The devil works hard, but John List works a lot harder. That's right. Today we're going over one of the most infamous family annihilators in history, and not even the big guy in the sky could save this dude from the fiery depths of the legal system. Here's a hint for all of you. Just because someone claims to be a religious man doesn't necessarily mean they're always going to act like it. And before we dive into this one, we are going to be diving into some buffalo chickpea mac and cheese. So, buckle up. On the morning of November 9th, 1971 in Westfield, New Jersey, John List woke up his kids to get them ready for school like he always did. John was a 46-year-old accountant who found himself suffering from a strained relationship. He sat there looking at his teenage kids as they ate their breakfast. 13-year-old Frederick and 15-year-old John Jr. and 16-year-old Patricia. And he made sure not to do anything out of the ordinary that might make them suspicious. After all, that was the whole point of the plan, so that they wouldn't know what was about to happen to them. As long as his family didn't suffer. Oh, as long as his family didn't suffer? Get a load of this guy, am I right? In John's head, things had always been strained in the List family, even if the rest of the family didn't necessarily see it. So John and Helen met after college, and they started dating pretty quickly. Now I'm gonna take some buffalo sauce and mix it with my chickpeas. Shortly after they'd begun dating, Helen told John one day that she was pregnant. John was a devout Lutheran and was like, okay, let's get married, I guess, and so they did. You know those classic love stories where two people fall and then the girl gets pregnant, so the guy's feels he has to propose even though he's not sure he even loves her? A tale as old as time. So romantic. But plot twist, right after the wedding, Helen revealed that she wasn't actually pregnant. Well, I guess that's one way to get a husband. So obviously John felt totally tricked, but once again, being a religious guy, he refused to break his marriage vows, so he stuck through it. That sounds fun, I guess. Helen, of course, got her mission of having kids like she wanted, and within 4 years, she popped out 3 little ones. Which, oh my God, 3 babies? That's so much to handle for a young married couple, right? John already didn't want to be in the marriage, and now he had 3 kids to take care of? Yikes. So I'm gonna take my chickpeas, I'm gonna line them on my baking sheet that's lined with parchment paper. Now I'm going to throw them into my oven. Not to mention, John had to be able to afford the 3 kids, and he was really struggling to find a job, as well as keep a job. So this was starting to really stress the couple out. He had trouble holding down a job because apparently there was something about John List that was a little off-putting, and he was always that type of employee who rubbed the boss the wrong way. I had that one coworker. You know the one that mine was, whatever, it doesn't matter. Even John's bosses said that they couldn't pin down exactly what it was about him that made them want to let him go. So they said his work was always meticulous, and he was a hard worker, but he was just creepy as hell. It's not a direct quote, I'm just paraphrasing. But then Helen and John finally got their lucky break when he landed a job as the VP of a bank in New Jersey. After landing the job, the List family was finally doing well financially. Actually, they were doing more than well. They were starting to become pretty wealthy. And Helen told John she really wanted him to buy this 19-room mansion because it was her dream home. Now, apparently, that was a good enough reason for him, so John, not being able to afford the mansion, asked his mother for a loan, and she gave it to him in exchange for this self-contained compartment on the 3rd floor. John was a bit of a mama's boy, and she was always happy to dote on her only son. Well, 6 years passed, and the Lists were living this lavish lifestyle that they always dreamed of. But little did John know that this falsely perfect life he thought he could build for himself was about to come crashing down around him all in a matter of months. Due to his weird personality, John was eventually fired from his bank job. This guy had to have been really weird, because this seems to always be the reason John was fired from all of his jobs. Something about this guy must have really triggered that fight or flight response in people or something. And then John did that horrible thing you see in movies where the dad doesn't tell anyone that he was fired, and he just keeps waking up and leaving for work and pretending like everything's all fine. I hate when people do that. It's just so God, it's creepy. He'd go to work, which meant just driving down to the train station, riding the train a few stops, getting off, and then getting back on another train to go back home. Ugh, I mean, so he's just sitting on the train like, yes, this is me, a normal guy going to a normal job, just sitting on the train all day long, sweating, not blinking, like a total robot. Ugh. He eventually found a few low-paying jobs, which he lost one after the other, and he was never able to keep up with his luxurious list lifestyle. He started skimming from his precious mom's bank account, and by 1971, he went completely bankrupt. If you guys didn't know, for the Lutherans, poverty is a huge sin. So this is not good for John List, the godly man. On top of that, it was the 1970s, and John was watching with horror as his 3 children entered their rebellious years and turned towards sinful culture. Let me guess, sinful culture meaning like listening to rock music too loud and dropping it low? Like, I mean, do people still say that? I mean, all right, well, okay. And worst of all, his daughter, Patricia, wanted to go into acting, like any teenage girl does at some point in their life. And I am gonna add some butter to my saucepan. And John thought that this was a very corrupt profession. Dude, you're about to pump your entire family full of bullets and you think that actors are the ones that are ungodly? He even thought Patricia might have been experimenting with the devil's lettuce, as well as trying her hand at witchcraft. So obviously, his family was spiraling out of control. Which again, MJ and witchcraft or family annihilation? Which is the lesser of two evils? I'm gonna add some milk to my butter. And then I'm gonna add some cheese. But the biggest strain on John was his wife, Helen, who was starting to drink so heavily that she was blacking out and falling down. She'd also lost vision in her right eye and had been relying heavily on tranquilizers to get her through the day. By this point, Helen had also stopped going to church, which you can imagine was a huge issue for John. Okay, so let's see what we've got. We've got a bankrupt man who refused to tell his family, his teen children slipping into sin, and a depressed wife with a drinking problem. And despite the fact that these are normal and fixable problems for the average family, John just doesn't see it that way. He considered taking his own life, but remember that's a sin in the church, so the option was out. So obviously the only option he saw left was to execute his entire family. I mean, Yeah, I don't forget about the classic commandment that's like, thou shalt smite your own family when the going gets rough, and ye shall still enter the gates of heaven. Apparently, living in the embarrassment of poverty was so unacceptable to him that he thought that that was the only way he could save his family's reputation. So, he worked out a plan in great detail, like he did with everything, and to fix his situation, which led him to sitting there at the table that morning in 1971, watching his children eat their breakfast before sending them off to school for the very last time. Now, when Helen woke up and came downstairs for coffee, she and John chatted like nothing was out of the ordinary. Then John came up behind her with his 9mm automatic and he just aimed it at her, the side of her head, and yeah, there you go. She was gone before she could even realize what had happened. And with that, John put Helen in a sleeping bag and dragged her into the grand ballroom. Oh, Jesus, a ballroom? What kind of family needs a ballroom? I don't think you're gonna be throwing very many family parties after this incident, John. Now, after that, he went up to his 84-year-old mother's apartment on the 3rd floor. She was making her breakfast when John found her. He said he felt like Judas and gave her a kiss goodbye. Brother! Yeah, dude, you're so brave for doing this. She asked him what the commotion was that she heard from downstairs, and John gave her some dumb, vague answer, and then he pulled the trigger on her. I don't know if you guys are getting this clearly. His own mother. I don't know if you guys heard me. His own mother. Homeboy has got some serious issues. Oh, and get a load of this shit. John said his mom's body was too heavy to drag to the ballroom, so he left her where she was and just tossed a towel over her face. Deciding that that was a proper ceremony for her, he went back downstairs to clean up the kitchen. Then he wrote letters and made phone calls to family, friends, teachers, and bosses, saying the family was leaving to help take care of some sick relatives in North Carolina. He dropped off the letters at the post office and stopped the mail delivery to his home. mansion. He also canceled their milk deliveries, newspapers, and Amazon Prime accounts. Just kidding. I just wanted to make sure that you guys were all paying attention. Finally, he dropped by the bank and cashed his dear mummy's $2,000 savings bond, around $13,000 today. He headed home after Johnny's big day out, made himself a sandwich, and waited for his kids. Brace yourself, guys. It's going to get much worse. Patricia came home from school early because she hadn't been feeling well that day, and John chose a .22 pistol he'd kept from his time in the war to deliver her bullet, laying her body next to her mother's in the ballroom. After that came Fred, who was taken out the same way as the others and placed next to Patricia. John Jr. had a soccer game that day, so John Sr. freaking drove out to the field to watch his son play and then gave him a ride home. And this part is horrible. When they got home, John Sr. popped John Jr. in the back of the head, but instead of falling instantly like the rest of the family, he struggled. John Sr. ended up firing 9 rounds at his only surviving son before dragging him into the ballroom with the rest of the List family. John said a prayer over them from the Lutheran hymnal, cleaned up the mess as best as he could, then sat down at the dinner table to eat alone. Oh, I'm sorry. So the whole time you're cleaning your family's remnants off the walls, you're going, all this scrubbing is getting me pretty hungry? Seriously, who thinks true crime and cooking are a good pair? But this guy really said that after dinner, he cleaned up, went to bed, and slept better than he had in years. Like, we know that you're a but you don't have to brag about it. And that next morning, John the craptist turned down the AC to keep the bodies preserved, turned on every light in the house, and blared the radios to his favorite classical stations in order to make it seem like people were home and no one would break in. Then he wrote a 5-page confession letter to his pastor and cut out every picture of him in every family photo around the house and walked out the door, locking it behind him. Which is dramatic as hell, but also makes it harder for the police to know right away what this dude looks like and where to find a picture of him. Now I'm gonna add my cooked noodles into my sauce. John drove to the JFK airport, dropped off his car, and then took a bus back into the city. After that, he took a train to Denver and applied for a social security card under the name of Robert Peter and began his new life as a short order cook. Robert Peter Clark sounds like the fakest name of all time. It's literally just 3 first names strung together. Really creative stuff here. Because the List family lived a very private life. It almost took a month before anyone would start asking questions about them. Patricia's drama teacher was concerned about her long absence and said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had already found John List to be a very strange guy the few times he'd met him. But it was something that Patricia had said to him earlier that was now stuck on the loop in his head. Patricia had confided in him that she was afraid of her dad was going to knock down the whole family. Which I feel like if a student tells you she's afraid of her own father, I don't think that's something you should necessarily keep to yourself. All the while, the house sat there like a giant refrigerator while the lights slowly began to burn out one by one, leaving the mansion cold, dark, but still filled with classical music playing over the speakers. Now, finally, the drama teacher convinced another teacher to go over to the mansion to check on the house with him. Always bring a buddy. That's rule number 1. When the neighbors saw some people that they didn't recognize peering into the List windows, they called the police. When the police got there, the teachers explained what was going on. So the cops began knocking and looking through the windows as well to see if anything was out of place. They were gonna leave, but the neighbors were like, nah, bro, we haven't seen this family in weeks. You gotta make sure that they're okay. Now, finally, the cops were able to find an unlocked window and climbed in. The cops got in and are immediately thrown into a scene out of a horror movie. No, not the red splatters all over the walls and a monster in the closet scene. They find themselves in more of an eerie psychological thriller. The house was completely dark, except for one single light upstairs that cast spooky shadows all over the house. The air was completely still and as icy as a meat locker, but worst of all, the haunting funeral music was blaring over the loudspeakers throughout the house. Literally so terrifying. Don't you love how classical music can kind of be beautiful in one context and completely terrifying in another? Anyway, when they got to a set of curtains that were closed in an area of the ballroom, they slowly parted them and were immediately hit in the face with the smell of decomposition. Neatly laid in their sleeping bags, the cops found the bodies of Helen, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. They found the confession letter and the weapons that were used to kill them, and after reading the instructions in the letter, they found John's mom's body upstairs. Yikes. Immediately, they put a nationwide notice for their wanted suspect, John List, and soon were able to track down his abandoned car at the JFK airport. They couldn't find any records of John taking any flights, and there were no more leads or clues that indicated where he could have gone. It seemed that John List, like Katy Perry's hit song Firework, was like a plastic bag drifting through the wind wanting to start again. That next August, the List mansion caught fire and burned to the ground, with people believing it had been some sort of arson. When it was discovered that the stained glass ceiling in the ballroom was signed by Louis Comfort Tiffany, it made the glass worth well over $100,000, which could have easily solved all of John List's financial problems. But as you guys have quickly learned, John wasn't exactly the sharpest cheddar slice in the package. As the years passed, the police continued to follow up on every tip, sighting, and lead they received, but they ultimately all went nowhere. Finding John List was about as easy as putting a camel through the eye of a needle. In 1989, the case had been cold for nearly 18 years. The investigators tried to get John's case featured on the new hit TV show, America's Most Wanted, that year, but the show turned them down, saying the case was just too old and too cold. Yeah, my dudes, like, that's kind of the whole problem, hence why they want it on the show. Everything changed when the host of the America's Most Wanted, John Walsh, heard of the case. This case struck a chord in John Walsh, whose 6-year-old son's case had also gone cold for 27 years before the perpetrator was caught, and he wanted John List to be brought to justice. A child annihilator was the worst thing you could possibly be in John Walsh's book, and he decided that he had to take on the case. But like the producers said, this case was too old and too cold, and John List could look like any old white dude out there. Walsh knew that in order to finally locate John List, they would need an image of how he would have looked then in 1989 as a 60-something-year-old guy. So John Walsh hired a forensic sculptor named Frank Bender to create a sculpture of the perp, age 18 years later, as a 60-something-year-old guy. Let me get my chickpeas out of the oven. Ooh, here we are. I'm gonna let these rest. But he wanted to make sure that they got him as accurate as possible. So John Walsh reached out to a forensic psychologist to build a detailed profile of John List, and he also looked at pictures of how his parents had aged to try to age him more accurately for a man in his 60s. And for the final touch, the forensic anthropologist knew that John List would not be complete without a pair of glasses, and he visited multiple thrift stores before he finally found the pair a guy like John List would wear, conservative with thick black frames. And finally, the world's creepiest art project was complete. And guys, I swear to you when I tell you this bust is one of the creepiest and most realistic things you'll ever see. And the kicker, it looks exactly like John List. It's almost like his twin or something. And on May 21st, 1989, the List family episode aired to over 22 million true crime fans all over the country. Two fans in particular, Wanda Flannery and her daughter Ava Mitchell, were watching the show one night in their Denver home when their jaws hit the floor. Before the bust of John List was even shown, they were certain just by the description of the man that the description matched their former neighbor Bob Clark. Just as they said on the program, the man was soft-spoken, always wore a suit, was probably still working as an accountant, and a devout Lutheran. When the show revealed the bust of John, they sat in stunned silence. There, on their own TV screen, was an exact replica of their old neighbor, even down to the glasses, and they immediately called the tip line. I'm sorry, can I just say, like, every true crime fan's dream? That is exactly the reason we watch those shows. When the authorities showed up at Bob Clark's house in Virginia 11 days later, his new wife, Dolores, told them her husband was at work at his accounting job. When they show up at Bob's office and find him, the agents are stunned to see the replica of their sculpted bust standing there in the flesh. I can just imagine them standing there and seeing him for the first time, and they're trying not to scream. Like, what are the odds? They asked him if he was Bob Clark, and he said yes. But when they asked him if he was John List, he said no. Even when his fingerprints were found to be an exact match, he still continued to deny it. Well, John was arrested and charged for taking the lives of his 5 family members and would finally be put on trial after 18 long years of freedom. What a So now I'm gonna take some mac and cheese, and I'm gonna spoon it right into my bowl. On April 11th, 1990, the jury found John the Lutheran guilty on all 5 counts and was given 5 consecutive life terms. And when his sentence was read, the courtroom legit burst into applause. See? When we say we're fans of true crime, we're not fans of the actual heinous part of it. We're people in the courtroom that are bursting into applause when they finally sentence that to spend the rest of his life in prison. The only person who wasn't happy about this was John Walsh, who thought John List deserved the ultimate punishment for playing God with his own family. Many of the law enforcement officers who worked on the case credited the incredible work of the artist Frank Bender for helping them finally crack one of their oldest cold cases at the time. John Walsh even kept the bust in his office for years as a tribute to Frank, who passed away in 2011. I'm gonna garnish my mac and cheese with my buffalo chickpeas. John List eventually croaked in prison from pneumonia at the ripe age of 82, an age the rest of his family would never live to see. And despite the fact that John tried to be a devoted Lutheran his whole life, I really don't think that they let him in through those pearly white gates. I've got a feeling it's getting a little toasty where John ended up. And that is the story of how one incredible clay sculpture was ultimately able to track down the family annihilator, John List. Damn, I told you guys that this was a bad one. But this story makes me want to do a few Hail Marys before bed tonight, seriously. Like John's final resting place, it's time to crank up the heat on this bad boy and try out our buffalo chickpea mac and cheese. Delicious. We will see you guys on the next one.